guys, welcome to Amity Tracks, and welcome to our Beach Boys series we're starting here. Now, those of you who have kept meticulous records of all the shows we've ever done, I did do a Beach Boys show a couple years ago, and it was really when I was kind of in the midst of my first real deep dive into the Beach Boys. And I kind of restricted it to, was it like 1965 to about 73 or so, but we're gonna do the whole thing. We're gonna look at the whole career, the whole discography, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And there's a lot of all of it. And and that's one of the things that makes the Beach Boys so much fun to dive into. Is you have peaks, you have like the pinnacles of pop, pop music, they've created, and then you have some dreck and kind of all things in between. As you see here, I've tried to do my best Mike Love, in homage to the Beach Boys. But yeah, so it makes them a wonderfully messy story to tell and discography to dive into, and I don't know, it's a lot of fun. Honestly, I find it a little boring sometimes if I'm doing a discography where everything's great. I don't know, you get tired of praising everything all the time, so sometimes it's just as fun to dive into some like horrendously bad albums, and there are some here, believe me. And that again, that's what makes it fascinating. You have just like unbelievably bad stuff, and then just the peak of human musical creation, and all points in between with the Beach Boys. I mean, it's fantastic, and they're a fascinating story. So with this video, I kind of want to talk about the Beach Boys, do an introduction, talk about some really interesting topics with the Beach Boys. I want to talk about Smile. I want to talk about Dennis and Charles Manson. I want to talk about these just very interesting aspects of their story, and and I can talk a little bit about some compilations and some live albums and stuff like that. And then starting in the next episode, probably have to divide it into two. But we will do the studio rankings of the Beach Boys, the entire discography this time, which is 29 albums that I'm going to be addressing. And so it'll be fun. It'll be good. But yeah, I mean, when I was kind of doing my latest deep dive to sort of prepare for this series, I kept a little list of kind of all the different things that they pioneered. I mean, obviously they were really important in surf, music and all of that. But Baroque pop, if you want to call it that, the lo-fi bedroom dream pop, the first really important, or really I think the first Christmas album, right? Put out by kind of a pop rock band. You could argue the first unplugged, right? We'll talk about that record in the rankings. So yeah, I mean, just a lot of firsts. It's really interesting. Yet what's interesting about the Beach Boys is I think they are simultaneously like revered, for their great accomplishments, mostly attributable to Brian Wilson, but not completely, and you know, kind of dismissed at the same time. And it's like both. I mean, again, it's a fascinating story. That to get into. So yeah, I kind of want to talk about a lot of this stuff. I mean, you always have to start with Brian Wilson, right? I mean, the ultimate tortured genius of pop music. I mean, capable of just godlike beauty, but also, to be honest, was involved in a lot of mediocrity and less. And so, the dividing line really is Smile, or the Smile Sessions, and we'll talk about that in a second. But it doesn't stop with Brian Wilson. He's the eldest, but go to the middle Wilson brother. You have good time boy, but ultimately tragic figure Dennis Wilson, who blossomed a little later as a singer and even a songwriter. But a tragic end when he drowned in 1980, I think. I think so. Anyway, around there. And just a fascinating story with Dennis Wilson, the whole connection with Charles Manson and the Manson family. I mean, it's a fascinating story. And in my journey with the Beach Boys, I'm the youngest of the Wilson brothers, Carl Wilson. I've discovered one of my very favorite singers, and was also, I think, an interesting story because he was developing again, sort of a little bit later when Brian started to pull back a little bit. These other guys had to step in to keep it going, and that's when he discovered this talents of Dennis Wilson, but also the huge talents of Carl Wilson, who has become one of my favorite singers, and for a while was blossoming into a really interesting and good songwriter. But that's kind of stopped. I don't know. Anyway, so talk about that. And you can't deny. You have to acknowledge one of the biggest douchebags in all of rock and roll. One of the most hated figures, Mike Love, right? The cousin, Mike Love. Now, yeah, does he get maligned unfairly sometimes? I mean, maybe he does deserve some more credit than he gets. I mean, he has he has been the one who kind of kept the train rolling for a while. Uh, Whether it should have kept rolling or not, we can talk about. But um, but yeah, undeniably, you know, uh, one of the most maligned figures in rock and roll, and I think deserved, mostly. Um, a guy obsessed with transcendental meditation, right? So he should kind of have this peace and calm, but at least in public, exhibits the calmness of a rabid squirrel. I mean, Exhibit A. I just take you to his speech at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame when the Beach Boys were being inducted. Probably the most notorious speech in all of Rock and Roll Hall of Fame history, where just out of nowhere he rips into the Beatles, he rips into the Stones, and the Rolling Stones were like present, at that ceremony too. Uh, you know, Putting his band on, higher than all of them, challenging them to, seemingly challenging Mick Jagger to the equivalent of, let's meet behind the school, and just out of nowhere. So much so that later in the evening, when Bob Dylan came up to give his speech, one of my favorite quips ever is the first thing he says is, "I'd like to thank Mike Love for not mentioning me." So I mean, Mike Love, Mike Love, but and then you have kind of the family dysfunction, the family drama. You have abusive father, uh, jealous wannabe musician, manager Murray Wilson, right? And the interesting story of how primarily Brian, but all of them were able to sort of break free from Murray's control, right? But not before he did some serious damage to them financially and everything else. But anyway, I mean, it's you can't cover everything, in a reasonably, in a reasonable video, but I do want to cover some stuff now. A lot of the stuff I got was from reading this fascinating book. This is a really interesting book. It's called Heroes and Villains: The True Story of the Beach Boys by Stephen Gaines. Now, this focuses a lot more on the kind of the personal stories. It doesn't dive into a lot of musical analysis. I actually have on the way, um, which is considered sort of one of the definitive books on the Beach Boys, and I'm looking forward to reading it. I think it's Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys and the California Myth, and I forget the author off the top of my head, but supposedly that one dives a lot more into the creative process of music. This reads more like a tabloid in some ways, but it's really interesting. But I do want to talk about a couple topics here. I just got to get them out of the way in this video. I'll just say get them out of the way. They're really interesting. But talk about in this video, and the next video we can just start into the album rankings. You have to address Smile, right? You have to talk about Smile, because Smile is the dividing line. Smile is everything before sort of builds up to Smile, and everything that happens after, the Smile debacle is sort of in its wake. Has the shadow of Smile over it, and reverberations. And So yeah, you have to talk about Smile. So I mean, there have been books written about Smile. A lot of you guys are probably bigger experts than I am, so I'm not going to spend too much background. But this was supposed to be Brian Wilson's masterpiece. Now you could argue he already had his masterpiece with Pet Sounds, but this was supposed to be even bigger. Like redefining popular music. His answer to Sergeant Pepper, right? As Pet Sounds had been his answer to Rubber Soul. I mean, I don't know. A lot of critics, a lot of people do make a lot out of the supposed competition between the Beach Boys and the Beatles. And when I say creative competition, so really, it just tells you how remarkable Brian Wilson was. It was really Brian Wilson versus like the Beatles. Because Brian Wilson was the one coming up with the concepts and the ideas and writing a lot of music and all that kind of stuff. And I mean, just how much pressure Brian put on himself, to try and top what McCartney and Lennon were doing. And Wilson was one of the few people who I think like genuinely impressed the Beatles, especially Paul McCartney. It's a sort of pushed, Paul McCartney has famously said that God Only Knows is the greatest song he's ever heard, right? So high praise. So, but yeah, but leading into Smile, well, the thing about Smile is, first of all, Smile does not exist, right? There is no Smile. It was never finished. And so, what we have here is this is really the Smile sessions. This is stuff that was, and I'm trying to remember when this was actually released. It was 2000 teens or somewhere. I don't remember the year that this was actually put out. But, finally kind of collecting as much as we could from sort of master takes and all that to reassemble as best we could a Smile. And prior to this, of course, Brian Wilson put out, Brian Wilson Presents Smile, where he sort of, reconfronted his demons, and this was sort of this demon for him, and again, with his own band, sort of re-recorded and reassembled what he in his mind what Smile was going to be, and then of course this came out. Um, but all of this stuff is, that's a reassembly, a reimagining. This is, just the best stuff from these sessions, most salvageable stuff from the. Now, when I use the word salvageable, I mean you have some of great, amazing songs on here, but yeah, it's still a salvage job, and so that's I think it's important to remember that the Smile does not exist, and so it allows us to. I think there's a reason it's sort of the most famous lost album, in rock history. Is it allows us to, each of us to kind of put, in our own imagination what the perfect pop album would be, and it can't disappoint us because it's not there to, to actually disappoint us. And so, yeah, I think so many people, including me, have just sort of created this mythical Smile in our heads of what would the perfect pop, record be. But we do have this, we do have the Smile sessions, right? And yeah, and it's amazing what Brian Wilson had to battle. I mean, there's a lot of disagreement or discussion over, why it fell apart, why it didn't work. Because they had been working on it for a while. They obviously had a lot of stuff done, but the I mean, you have a lot of drug use that was going on that was obviously affecting them. Brian's mental state was getting more and more fragile. He didn't have a lot of support. There's varying accounts of that, but didn't seem to have a ton of support or at least understanding from a lot of the other band members, especially Mike Love. Now, of course, Mike Love denies saying this, but one of the most infamous quotes, right, is the story where Mike Love gets in Brian's face and says, "Don't f with the formula." Formula being, beaches, surfing, girls, and cars, right? I mean, that's what's gotten us where we've gotten, right? And then, I guess there's an argument there because, Love and a lot of these other, people that were around Brian, like didn't know where he was going with this, right? It's hard to really get into his mind and understand it. Um, Now, I think part of Love's problem was, Brian had started to collaborate with some outside songwriters for lyrics. Of course, with Pet Sounds, it was Tony Asher, and Love had some conflict with Asher, and then with Smile, he was working with Van Dyke Parks, and so he had started, and prior, a lot of the earlier Beach, simpler but great Beach Boys hits, had been kind of collaborations between Mike Love and Brian, right? And so, there might have been a little bit of hurt feeling there. I think jealousy, maybe, and that's understandable. If I were Mike, I'd probably feel the same, especially if I was like, I don't understand what the hell we're doing, with this new material. So you kind of have all that there, right? Then you have Dennis Wilson and Charles Manson. I mean, this is one of the most fascinating stories to me, because as a person who kind of, my living is really history, and I love that era and studying that era. I mean, I've read a lot about kind of that whole situation. Uh, and there's a lot of, you read any book about Charles Manson, and going all the way, of course, the classic of Helter Skelter, even interesting ones like this. Dennis Wilson play, oops. Dennis Wilson plays a prominent role, in this story. So the story is this, right? Dennis Wilson was driving along in L.A., picked up these two girls who were hitchhiking. Not an uncommon thing at that time. Took them to their destination. A little bit later, he was driving again, saw the same girls. This time, he brought them back to his house, and did whatever rock stars and hitchhikers do, and went off to a recording session. Came back way later and found his house to be full of people, strangers that he didn't know. Now, also with Dennis Wilson, that wasn't totally uncommon, for his house to just be used as a big party place, probably by a lot of people he didn't really know well. But this time it was, so the girls were there, but they had brought, their guru, a guy by the name of Charles Manson, and it was mostly his girls that were there. And the story is, Manson came out and introduced himself to Wilson, even got down on his knees and kissed his feet. And so begins sort of an interesting, uncomfortable friendship relationship between Manson and Wilson for a while. Now, part of it is Manson sort of plied Wilson, with his girls. Wilson sort of had whatever he wanted to do with as many of his Manson's girls as he wanted, and he indulged in that. Uh, in exchange, basically Wilson's house became their place for a while. They ate his food and swam in his pool and drove and crashed and sold his cars. And it's estimated Wilson, or maybe his manager, somebody estimated that the Manson family cost him well over $100,000. You know you could adjust that for today's value, but just mooching off Dennis, right? Uh, Dennis, eventually becomes very uncomfortable as Manson more and more reveals himself. But Charles Manson had dreams of rock stardom, right? He had songs, and it's Dennis Wilson that actually got Manson into a studio to let him record some demos. Yeah, Charles Manson actually recorded some in Brian Wilson's home studio. Um, Now, Brian was kind of his own doing his isolation and whatever. So supposedly Brian didn't really interact with Manson hardly at all. But it was Brian Wilson's studio where Manson was able to record some of his stuff. It was Dennis Wilson who sort of introduced Charles Manson into a lot of the kind of Hollywood, and rock royalty, including producer Terry Melcher, right? And if you want to just make all these connections, it was Terry Melcher's house. Terry Melcher was renting a house up on Cielo Drive, and then Manson had been up there and knew where the house was. And of course, Melcher moves on to a different place, and Roman Polanski rents that house. and of course, that's where the Tate murders occurred, right? One of the most famous, serial killing, of all, right? Mass murder of all. Um, and so, you can trace kind of all that connection back to Dennis Wilson, and it's interesting. Dennis Wilson supposedly just was, burdened with guilt for the rest of his life, for his unwitting role in sort of, helping Manson get into that world. Eventually resulted in those killings. So anyway, in fact, Dennis Wilson was supposed to testify at the trial, at Manson's trial, but he refused to do so because he was so terrified. So he ended up not testifying. But anyway, yeah, I mean it's a fascinating story. It really is. So what else we got here? Why don't we do this? Why don't we talk a little bit about compilations? Kind of get that out of the way, and then we can start the next video with with the ranking of the studio records. I do want to mention one comp. I went on Wikipedia and just counted. There's like over 50 Beach Boys compilations out there. I mean, but I just want to talk about a few. Um, I just want to mention this one. This is called "Good Vibrations: The Best of the Beach Boys," and this was what really, I had owned Pet Sounds for a while. It took me a while to really get Pet Sounds. Now, of course, I love it, obviously. So I'd had that for a while. I'd heard their surf hits and all that, but really it was buying. I picked this up in some used bin somewhere for $5. But this comp basically like focuses on like 1966 to about 73, and it was hearing songs like "Sail on Sailor" and "Add Some Music to Your Day" and "Do It Again" and "Surfs Up" and "Heroes and Villains," all which are on this comp. They're really like I just fell in love with those songs. I was like, okay, I got to explore some more, and then I went from here. So I don't know, just special mention for that comp. But of course, the most famous compilation, and I think the one that had the most effect on their career, positive and negative, is this, right? "Endless Summer." They had been a double album that really focuses on their kind of pre-Pet Sounds hits, right? Their early to mid '60s hits into the late '60s, a little bit pre-Pet Sounds. But and this came out when did this come out? Was it 70, 73, 74, somewhere in the early to mid '70s. After they had what I and many Beach Boys fans argue a really underrated, again, but it's being more appreciated now, but really underrated run post Pet Sounds, post Smile, you know, disintegration. A series of very good records, very creative records, where because Brian was sort of pulling back a little bit, people like Dennis Wilson and Carl Wilson, and some of the other guys had to step up and really find their own you know, creative life. And those are some great records. But they at the time they didn't sell very well, and so the Beach Boys were in financial dire straits. This came out, this compilation, and somehow it hit and became a massive seller, like totally saved their bacon financially. But also, I think this was a key point where it really killed off that creativity. Where I think maybe Mike Love's financial sensibilities kicked in, and they realized that the money was being made touring, doing the nostalgia thing, basically, playing the hits and all of that. And yeah, they did release some records after that. We'll talk about those records. But I mean, to me, the real creative greatness was kind of gone. And, so I mean, this is a hell of a collection. I think it's fantastic. A great summary of the kind of that first era of Beach Boys. But yeah, I don't know. I creatively speaking, I kind of wish that they had kept going where they were going before this hit. And then you kind of have what's essentially like a volume two, which is Spirit of America, which covers the same era, but more. So you got basically four records here of kind kind of those early to mid '60s hits, which again are fantastic. But I think changed the trajectory of what they were doing. And as far as live stuff, I'm not a huge fan of a lot of their live stuff. I do like this one. This is a good live record. This is the Beach Boys in concert. This came out 73, 1973. So it is kind of that sweet spot era that I really do love. And it's Brian's not there because Brian stopped really performing live by the time of today, Beach Boys today in 1965, when he wanted to just focus on studio work. He doesn't really rejoin them live till later. But you got Carl Wilson, Dennis Wilson, Mike Love, Al Jardine, and then you have Ricky Fattar and Blondie Chaplin, who I'm going to talk about them when we get to the album rankings. They were only there for 2 studio records, but I really liked it when those 2 guys were in the band. I think they added something, quite a bit. And so I think this is kind of cool, a live album with those 2 guys, in the band. And this is actually really good. I think this is a really good live album. I think it's underrated. I don't know. I think it's good. But anyway, so let me kind of tee up the next couple videos at least. There's probably gonna be 2 videos, but I'm gonna rank the studio albums. I've got 29 by my count. I'm not including the Smile sessions, so that's one reason why I kind of wanted to talk about it in this video. I've looked at some rankings. Some rankings do include it, some rankings don't. I decided not to because, as many of you may know, a lot of those songs, from the Smile sessions, ended up on, later records. Uh, especially in that era I was talking about, from 67, 68, to about 73. You have a lot of those songs from the Smile sessions were kind of farmed out, different versions, whatever, but ended up on those records. So as we address those records, I will address those songs. Okay, so but it's kind of hard to acknowledge those records and the Smile sessions, because if you look at the Smile sessions as a real record, then those other records shouldn't have had those track listings, right? So you know what I mean. So anyway, so like I said, I've kind of addressed the Smile sessions, and we'll address those songs, as we hit each of those records. All right, so now I'm looking forward to it. It's gonna be fun. Well, anyway, let's talk Beach Boys in the comments here, and then like I said, the next few videos we'll get into the studio album rankings. So I hope you join us, and we'll see you next time.